you talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. My question to you is, what has been the nature of the responses that you've been getting?
What I'm getting from white audiences is, one, a much more thoughtful look at it, because the fear, the pushback is, are you getting ready to try to blame me for something? Are you getting ready to try to get something from me? Is this about, well, it's not about you. And when they realize, it's really not about you, they're able to listen. And when they listen, it makes sense. It's certainly plausible. It's certainly something that, is reasonable. And either they are silent or they are in support.
The argument that you've so brilliantly raised about the impact of post-traumatic slave syndrome, does this apply just to the peoples of color who were victimized by it? Or were people who were melanin poor, as I like to say, did they suffer in carrying out this process?
Of course they did. Of course. It's impossible for that not to be the case. However, it is difficult to tease out what I would consider to be a pathology if, in fact, you're the one winning. You see, one would not look at that and go, but wait a minute now. We're winning. We have all the goods. We're in control. Well, that doesn't mean you're not twisted. Okay. But there's the assumption of the accumulation of goods, power, and control over those things, which would suggest success and superiority and okayness. And it's not. And as a matter of fact, a very good example of that, I mean, Katrina showed us all, but I think that our inability, particularly white people, to engage in a discussion, let me be very clear about that, about slavery, without becoming extremely defensive, attacking, amazing. Because when you just say, you can't get the whole word out, slavery, without people saying, oh, wait, stop it. No, are you trying to find an excuse? Are you people just unwilling to take responsibility? I mean, this is before you get the whole word out. But you can get out Holocaust. Yes, you can get that out. You can talk about it at length. You can talk about it a lot. You can talk about multi-generational trauma with every other group except Africans. And that always amazed me. And to me, that is, if nothing else, a symptom of an elephant in the room that Europeans are terrified to address. And basically what I hear, literally when I say to people, what is it that you're feeling? I literally had a conversation in the airport 2 days ago. Because, I'd been in there way too long. This is one of those terminal experiences where we're in there way too long, you start talking to strangers. It was one of those kind of things, and we ended up in a conversation, and this gentleman said, when I said post-traumatic slave syndrome, I saw his body change. And it was wonderful because here's an opportunity for me to do a little research, So as we engaged in the conversation, all of the pushback was there. What are you trying to say? I'm going, you haven't really heard what I've said. But I'm curious about what your concern is. He says, well, I can tell you what white people's immediate concern. I mean, by the end of it, we were all good friends. But in the interim, when I brought the discussion up, the pushback was there immediately. And he says the first thing white people are going to think is, do I have any, am I somehow associated with this? Is there any blame associated with me? Do I bear any responsibility? That's the first personal response that's there. So why is that your response? I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about African-American people. Why is that your response? And again, that speaks to the injury, whether it's guilt or fear. There's a book, Gil, came out this year, 2006. It's called Breaking Rank by Norm Stamper, 34-year white police veteran, chief of police for San Diego, chief of police for Seattle. Wrote a book called Breaking Rank. He has a chapter called Why White Cops Kill Black Men. And he surmises, is it's due to fear. A fear of black men. And he goes so far as to say, the bigger and the blacker, the greater the fear. You have the gun. You have the weapons. You have the power. Why are you afraid? And how much of that fear has to do with what you know is an inherent, consistent, and historical injustice. And that this individual you're stopping might be a little upset about that.
The singers have it.
How difficult it is for us to engage in that. We can talk about Japanese internment. We can talk about Jews and Holocaust. We can talk about Native Americans and the issue of colonialism. We can even talk about Aboriginal people in, the other side of the world. can't talk about Africa, Africans, and slavery. You get punished for that. And that, to me, was the first indication I need to look at it.
Are Native Americans' sufferings factored into your presentations, or is it ever raised?
It's always raised, and I think that, of course, when you begin to look at the research that's been done, I don't know if you're familiar, if you haven't interviewed Maria Braveheart Yellowhorse, who is doing complementary work with mine. I work with Maria, so clearly, as a matter of fact, I was reading her articles when I was doing my research.
Oh.
So when she started looking at multi-generational trauma as it related to indigenous people, of course, there's clearly a linkage.
Moving towards the present-day scene, we see a lot of trauma in the inner city. I'm sure you've been pummeled with this. But we need to get from you your analysis of what's going on here and what it purports for the future.
A lot's going on. I think that when we begin to look at urban settings, you cannot separate out. There are parallel processes that are going on that I believe on a general level. You have a level of disintegration that's going on. You have a level of rebuilding and integration. The disintegration is rapid. And it's a disintegration on a number of levels, materially, economically, morally. I mean, you can just go down the list, ecologically. In my field, the focus, the buzzwords of 2006 is certainly evidence-based practice and the notion of ecological systems perspective, person in environment. Well, let's look at the persons in their environment. And what in that environment is fostering healthy behavior, and what in that environment is fostering non-productive and unworkable kind of behavior. And so one has to look at that as a social scientist. And I would submit to you that the differential treatment, which has been consistent in families that we've seen, families are looking out and seeing the inconsistencies of differential treatment. In a country that says, send us your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and one then wants to take a look at, is the playing field balanced? Has it ever been leveled? Some folks don't have bootstraps to pull themselves up from. Others do. But what is it that we're working with, and what is it that America is telling urban America? What is the media speaking to in terms of urban America? In other words, let me ask you a very simple question. How does a 16-year-old African-American male living in the projects, how does he get respect? How does he do it? A gentleman by the name of Howard Stevenson, Penn State University. He advanced some work with young boys. He has a program called Play, where he's using athletics and sports to deal with issues of anger and violence. Long story short, he started to look at what works, what doesn't. He was able to affect school performance, academics, through simple things. One of them, key, was respecting them. Key, touching them. Now that's an amazing thing. He says, because you see, they are truly the untouchable in today's society. They're the untouchables. They don't feel touched. They don't feel loved. He also said something that flies in the face of what many say. They want boundaries. They'll scream, why are you always on me? You're checking my grades, you're calling me on everything, and they know you care about me. So it was critical for them to have boundaries and to know that someone cared enough to pull those coattails. And when he said that they just wanted, how important it was to put that hand on the shoulder, the arm around them. They're our boys. There's something that he always, boys not men. Boys not men. They're boys. And they don't get to be boys because they're untouchable. So we're looking at young men growing up in an environment becoming hyper-masculine, trying to figure out a way to gain respect in a world that does not respect them, in a world that is afraid of them, in a world that pushes back from them, in a world that won't touch them. And similarly, young females who are trying very desperately to figure out how to navigate, and then begin to look at the images on television, the images of telling them who they are and what they are. And these are consistent. I.e., let's go all the way back to the minstrel shows. It hasn't changed much. Women are the over-sexualized, objectified. Males are the over-sexed, violent, criminal, gangster, all of the things. Case in point, there's a gentleman I know who's a spoken word artist, and we have a lot of very positive hip-hop going on. There's a lot of positive hip-hop, but you don't hear about that. He talked about a actual a record they made that was called Black Power, a song. It was called Black Power. When he presented that to the music execs, they said, oh, no, you can't put that on there. You cannot put, no, absolutely not. So it got renamed Crack Music. Didn't change a word, but changed the title, Crack Music. And they said, oh, that'll be okay. So we got to remember what is being promoted.
Why don't we stick a pin on that? Why don't we just take a break now, and then we'll continue. We'll be right back.
And dangerous marrying of hip-hop with pornography. Watch that one. So we're looking at a society, because all you have to do is do the math. If you can look at Uncut or any of these other after midnight shows, imagine what pornography has to do to sell over the top of that. And you're looking at a level of dehumanization and violence that we've never seen before. So I think there's a lot happening in urban America, not to mention the fact that you have people who are, quote unquote, on reservations. We're supposed to be desegregated, but we know that didn't happen. You can go to every major urban setting in America, even with gentrification, and you know where all black folks are. And they are on that reservation, modeling the same behavior on that reservation, generation after generation.
Let me ask you this. Did the Katrina tragedy enhance your thesis that you had been?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
In what way?
In this way. That part of what, the work that I talk about, and again, Gil, it's no news that in order to look at healing on any level, psychologically or physically, you look at history. You go to the doctor right now for anything, he's going to ask you your history, your mama's history, your daddy's history. It's not a new phenomenon either to look at history. And all I wanted to do was look at patterns of behavior. I wanted to understand what I was looking at. What did we learn and what did we fold into what we believe is cultural norm? And, it's called, a friend of mine calls it the poison in the cookies. So we got poison in the cookies. So we got to tease out the poison. But what I saw that was consistent with Katrina was that historically, what people have done, namely those in power, and in this case Europeans, to reconcile the inconsistency with deeming themselves to be superior and civilized. How does one reconcile believing that, saying that, promoting this morally superior being or group of people, and yet engaging in behavior that is barbaric? Hence, raping, mutilating, slaughtering, selling, breeding other human beings. How does one reconcile that? Very simply, you have to justify the behavior. How do you justify the behavior? By relabeling the people to fit your behavior towards them. Simple. Now, let me give you Katrina. Huge, giant flood. Terrible hurricane stuff. Everybody's upset. Covers get pulled back. We see a whole lot of black people, and so does the rest of the world. And the rest of the world said, oh, shame on you, America. Figuratively and literally, shame on you. So then, immediately, what does the media do? Because people are feeling right now that dissonance, the disconnect, that the inability to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed we were as a country. That's called cognitive dissonance. So they were trying to figure out, how do we remove it? Oh, my God. So the first thing they did was they started to say, well, I don't know, do you think it's class or do you think it's race? What do you think, Frank? They started to intellectualize it. Distraction. Meanwhile, babies are dying. But America's engaging in a dialogue, whether it's class or race. Who cares what it is? You see, because I'm trying to remove the dissonance, to distract people from the obvious. So then when that didn't work, they started to figure out the witch hunt. Who did it? Who's responsible? Is it that mayor? Who is it? Is it the governor? Who do we need to get? Who do we need to go after? Once again, another distraction. Babies are dying. And all we're seeing is armed guards circling these people who are suffering. And the most important piece, when they couldn't do it any longer, they said, but aren't they just looters and rapists? Didn't they zero right in and go, so therefore, you see, they're bad people, and they therefore deserve it. Then they have a blackout, and everybody can go to sleep and say they deserve what happened to them.
Dr. Leary, you went to New Orleans, right?
I did. My family's
recently.
from... Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Give me a snapshot of what you saw.
I think the first thing that I experienced was, going into the Ninth Ward and seeing what looked like a battlefield, the ruins. I mean, I was walking through ruins. What was most, what you first do is the smell is what gets you first. It's just a smell, for me, because everything died. You have to understand. It was human beings that died, but dogs died, cats died, rats died, everything died. And so there is this palpable, almost, the smell of death. And with that is sewage and everything else. It's dried now and hardened. You see the watermarks. You see the numbers written of those found dead or alive, and these sorts of things written on the sides of buildings. And interestingly enough, there was a church, and inside the church, all the pews had come together, actually into a pile. And the only thing that remained on the wall was, he walketh beside the still waters. You know, that was the only thing on the wall, which was kind of an eerie reality.
Did you talk to any grassroots?
Of course, I spoke with one woman who was just amazing. She was a nurse who would go in, in-home nurse, black woman who was walking me through and pointing out where she would take care of different clients. The house wasn't there. I mean, flattened like a pancake. And I know that there were many more bodies, because based on what I saw, there was no way you could have even gotten to the bodies based on what I saw. She says, yes, I took care of this man and this house and this woman and her own house, which she lost. But she never left. This woman spent, she's an unsung heroine, She did the work. She stayed. She loved her people, and she was there for them. She would have been there for them before. She was there before the flood, and she was there after. And I spoke to young people. A group of us African-American mental health professionals actually addressed many who came to my area of the world and talked to them about their stories. And one gentleman who had come for 3 days on a bus, he traveled 3 days on a bus with his baby and the baby's mother. They were young, early 20s. Mm-hmm. And 3 days, baby sick, and that I ended up going with him to the hospital to just check any respiratory problems. On that bus were people who were sick, people who were mentally ill, people who were in recovery, people who were elderly. Everyone was on that bus for 3 days. He got to Portland, Oregon. They put him up in a hotel, only briefly. Put him up in a hotel. And he says, of all the things that happened, being on the rooftop, hearing the gurgling sounds of people drowning, and waking up and finding who was left. He said, all the things they didn't tell you, seeing people like pin cushions in the trees, like pin cushions and cushions in the trees. He says, what hurt me most? He said, what hurt me most was when I turned on the television in Portland, Oregon, and I saw that they were sending airplanes to pick up animals, pets. He says it hurt. That's when the tears streamed from his eyes. He says, when I saw that they were sending airplanes to pick up animals, and I carried my baby for 3 days on a bus. He said, nothing broke his heart. Broke his heart more. He says, how can this be? That, again, the notion of dehumanizing a whole group of people is consistent. And I think that, you're probably familiar with Without Sanctuary, which is the lynchings, the book of lynchings. And in 2005, the first apology, and many representative senators didn't sign off on that apology even then. But it took that long. It took 6 presidents to outlaw it. Now I want you to consider that. Consider the fact that, America, and how could you, in knowing that those lynchings, who it was. This wasn't during slavery. You don't lynch your property. Let's be clear. It was a Klan and after slavery that those lynchings, hence Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. Right. So you talked about the injury to white people. When you look at that book, and certainly not table reading, but if you look at that book and you look at the pictures, you see children. You don't see the fat, buck teeth, redneck, balding, pot-bellied Klan member. You see plain old common folk, little children looking at bodies. And the only way, there's a picture in particular, most people know about it. This little girl is looking at a black man who is hanging from a tree. Not far away is where they're eating. She's looking, everybody's in their Sunday best. Children, adults, youth, everybody's staring around it. But this one little girl is looking up at this slave, or this black man, whatever she deemed him, smiling, a smirk on her face. This is a child. The only way she would not be horrified, which she should be, because she would be more horrified if there was a puppy hanging from that tree. But she wasn't horrified looking at that man because he was no longer human to her. And that's what happened to white people for dinner. You know what I'm saying? They just saw the title of my presentation and try to figure out whether or not they're going to, these are scholars, whether they're going to distance themselves from me because I was a little too black. right? And they didn't know. They were looking around trying to wage what the white people were going to think. And surely, not after dinner, well, we can hang, okay? But during dinner, in a long white tablecloth, they got to figure out who they want to be seen with, and maybe I wasn't one of them. Now, there was some that was, by the end, they thought it was okay. But they didn't want to be an embarrassment. They didn't want to be lumped in at whatever I said I was or who I was, which might cause embarrassment to them. There were people during Katrina, black people, who saw those other black people and instead of feeling empathy, felt shame.
Really?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Because they don't want to be identified with them. I've pulled myself up from my bootstraps. I'm certainly not one of those complaining, whining Negroes that are saying, blaming anyone else. I'm not one of them, right? I mean, that's the fear, because that's, again, what's been projected about who we are. So people are trying to distance themselves from that. No, I'm not one of those. If these people just worked hard, that would be fine for them.
Antidote?
Well, the truth. It's the truth. We've got to tell the truth. Okay. There will be no choice left. We are going to have to do that in order to survive here. I would venture to say within the next 10 years, if we don't recognize that we have to raise the bar, certainly not lower it. We got to raise it, and we got to reach it in order to survive here. That's the reality. And I think that, again, the notion of a community of leaders, I'm telling my children, yes, it's nice, I'm glad you're going to school, you got to get, but you need to have a plan B. Okay, let me just say now, you better find a plan B. You better figure out a way to own it and run it and not look for the job, because the job may not be there. But you need to start thinking more as, again, leadership in all those areas, and particularly in business.
The spate of reports recently about corporate theft is just rampant among the headlines for some time now. Is this a post-traumatic event for the power elite?
Interesting. I had the opportunity, I wish I would have had some, I spoke with other people who this is their area, certainly not my genre,
okay.
But I saw the video, the smartest guys in the room, and the Enron, the smartest guys in the room, and I was blown completely away. I was totally blown away. You know, I started trying to find something comparable in my life to fit with what they did. And greed begets greed. Privilege begets greed. Privilege begets this notion of being above the law, because you've always been above the law. You know what I'm saying? It never applied to you. And simply something as simple as saying, well, you know, here's a huge company. We're talking about billions of dollars that was never real. That was what was amazing to me. I'm not talking about floating a check. Okay, not talking about floating a check. I'm talking about saying, well, I'm not going to check them out if Merrill Lynch signed on. Why should I have to check whether they're legit if Merrill Lynch signed on? So everyone signed on to an invisible amount of money because of greed, power, and the whole notion of privilege. So amazing. And it's simply what it was. These were folks that were above reproach. They were above questioning because the name signified. That was simply enough. That means that you had to be, you know, certainly ethical. No one questioned. No one looked at the books. No one looked to even see if the money was there, and it never was. So it was absolutely the superiority, the arrogance. I mean, that's what the word that comes out constantly when you see these people, arrogance. Where do you get that arrogance? You're privileged. You've been running it this way and, you know, having differential treatment your entire existence. So why should it stop now? Only now the people that got hurt got mad at you. Okay, some of those folks had enough power to say, oh, wait, we can do it to them, but you don't get to do that to me because I look like you. You don't get to do that to me. See, that's where the buck stopped. If it was you or I mean, we wouldn't even probably reach the news. But when they started looking, you know, doing it to each other, then it was like, oh, wait a minute now. You don't get to do that to me. And I really believe it is a reflection of an out-of-control amount of power and privilege, which has been born from misusing, rape, and pillage, you know, all across the world.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, eventually that's going to catch up with you. And it is, on a global level, catching up. You know, here's the bottom line. We need to play well with others and share. It's something we're going to have to do. We don't want to do it, but we're going to have to share. and play well with the others. In addition to that, we're going to have to be more appreciative of our earth, who is weary of us.
I want to tread in an area that maybe I shouldn't, but I can't resist it.
Okay.
About who Joy Leary is. I've seldom heard you talk about your parents. Can you give us at least a snapshot or two?
You know, my parents, they said you learn to really appreciate and respect your parents when you become one. And I'm not only a parent now, but I'm a grandparent. And so I appreciate what my parents had to work with, what they had to contend with while raising children that they wanted to feel a sense of dignity and a sense of value and worth. And it was a difficult thing. My father was a proud, proud man. He died earlier than he should have.
Really?
Surely. My father died as a result of many complications of alcoholism while he had was no longer drinking when he died. Many of those years of trying to drown out a lot of the pain and the feeling of disrespect that he had to shoulder, it took its toll. And similarly on my mother, who also had severe complications as a result of alcoholism. And I know that my parents, the one thing they did was they raised us to be children that questioned, which was new and unique. Because, we were raised in a seen but not heard kind of environment. Children don't engage with adults. This is, and my father said, if you have a question, there's something you need to know, there is no question that you cannot ask, so long as you ask it in an appropriate way. But if you want to know, I don't care who it is standing in front of you, you get to ask that question. So my father would engage us in conversations from religion to politics to
our history?
Our history, everything.
Really?
He called himself an Asiatic black man before people were saying black was beautiful. And I remember, I recount this in my book, this story of my father. And my mother was, let me just kind of give you a picture. My mother was a mother of the community. My mother always said to me, like whenever I would whine or complain, she used to always give me the little quote, which would always put me in place. She said I used to cry because I had no shoes until I met a man who had no feet. So, Joy, it may be deep for you, but trust me, it's deeper for someone else. And there's always enough. So there was never a time in my house when you didn't have enough food to feed whoever walked through that door. There's always, I was raised with there will always be enough. So we always had folks at the house. She fed the whole neighborhood, my mother. And that was just her idea, is that there's always enough. And my father grew out of a very proud tradition. These are folks from Louisiana, from the Bayou. Seriously.
Really?
My grandfather was no joke. He did not play. Everybody, black and white, respected my grandfather. And my father kind of grew up with that whole notion, but he walked into an extremely, when he moved from the South, the huge migration to the South, from the South to the North, and particularly, my family, some of us moved to California, Los Angeles, then they started to, that's when the pressures came on. My father worked every day of his life, never missed a day of work, 16 years, and suddenly was laid off with nothing. And it devastated him.
That's when he began to take it out on himself.
That's when the fall happened. But there was an incident that occurred. My mother's father is from Jamaica and Belize, that part of the family. And we had an occasion where some two relatives came to visit. One was my Aunt B. Aunt B, I loved Aunt B. She had a smile. She was rich, deep, dark chocolate, and always smiling, sweet, quiet. With her was I don't even know who the woman was. I know she's a relative, but because of what happened in the house, I didn't get her name. Okay, she was a fair-skinned woman, and she was related, cousin, something. So she came with Aunt B. She had just come to visit us in Los Angeles. I was a small child. So she would favor me because I was the lighter complexioned child. Now, my daddy's checking this out. Now, remember, my daddy does not play. My mother knows my father, so she's looking at my father. And I was getting a little warm about how she's saying, I could take her back with me, and she could kind of favoring me. And so, of course, my dad distanced me from her immediately. And I was just a kid. I didn't know what was going on. But my father and mother knew. And my mother's trying to smooth things out because she knows my dad. And finally, this woman started to tell my Aunt B, rich chocolate Aunt B, get me my slippers, B. I need a glass of water. By the third time she said something, my father said, oh, B, don't get up. And B goes, oh, no, no, that's okay. It's the way. He goes, it's not the way in my house. So now this woman who gets in a huff because she's used to being privileged, you see. She said, well, no, no, this is, how dare you? My father goes, B, don't you get up and get her another thing. This is what he tells her. At this point, my mother's crying because she knows where it's going. Okay, my mother knows. She's just quiet, but she's crying because she knows my father, it's all over. So the woman further engages my father and confronts him. Father's very quiet, doesn't say anything, gets up, just leaves the room. Now my mother, she just is like, because she knows where it's going. We don't see my father for quite a while, but there's a lot of tension in the room. B is tense, my mother, I'm tense because everybody else is tense. I don't know what's going on. My father comes out with all of her bags, her suitcases, her little purse, whatever little stuff she had, opens the front door, puts them on the front porch, quietly walks over to her, grabs her by the arm, and pushes her and all her stuff out of the door and locks it.
There's nothing like subtlety.
That was it. Never saw her again. And my mother's crying, wailing.
Oh,
because
my.
She don't know how. All B was here on the inside. The other woman was on the other side of the door. He goes, she can't.
In the telling, you reveal a lot about the chemistry between your parents.
Oh, yes.
They were on the same page.
Well, no, not really. My mother really would have preferred to somehow, let's mediate this. Let's find a. And see, my father was he saw what was happening, and there was no fixing it. My mother would have preferred, let's sit down, Oscar. Let's talk about it. Perhaps we can help them understand how we function in the house. My mother would have preferred that. My father, cut to the chase. You're out. We're done. I don't want my children to see this. I don't want them to I don't want to have to explain to them the nonsense getting ready to go on in this room around who's favored because of their skin color or their hair texture. Not happening here. Now, I understand my people from Louisiana, we are the whole, spectrum, but never did that issue come up. And it wouldn't come up in my family around people getting divided based on that kind of stuff. I don't know how we escaped it. That's not to suggest we didn't have some crazy going on. Don't get me wrong. We always had the little strange one that nobody wanted anybody to know about. It was just the whole idea that part of who we were, that sense of pride in who we were and our accomplishment. Meanwhile, my mother is raised by my grandmother, Ophelia. And Ophelia was no joke. Ophelia was like, my grandmother said, don't ever... I remember her telling me, and in the book I actually do a dedication to my grandmother who said to me, you're smart. Don't ever forget that. You're smart, and don't ever let anybody tell you that you're not smart. Your father's smart, your mother's smart. You come from smart people. And when you cross my grandmother, she would get quiet and she'd look at you. She said, now what part have I given you in my play? She'd go, what part you going to play? This is my play. She did that till she was like 89 years old. So there was this sense of, one, very strong women in my life. My aunt, who was one of the first computer programmers at UCLA. I had folks that knew who they were and were clear and had high expectations of me from the time I was small. Meanwhile, my high school guidance counselor, a middle-aged white woman, told me I wasn't college material and I shouldn't even try. That was at Crenshaw High School. I'm telling you, that was where she told me, you needn't try, you are not college material. This would be the person that helps you.
Right.
Right. She's a middle-aged white woman that I think didn't like children in general. And the only regret I have is that she didn't live long enough for me to blow her hair back. But, the point is that I had, and I want to make a real point about that. While you talk about the inner city urban, you're looking at what, and I would recommend that people look at the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Clearly, coupled with a very, very intense history that built and created resilience as well as some non-positive adaptive behavior, you have all these issues of adverse childhood experiences, one parent, incarceration, mental illness, all of these things, right? But what we don't speak about is what are the protective factors? How important is it for someone to tell you you're beautiful? For someone to tell you I love you, to put that arm around the shoulder and say no matter what battlefield of racism, discrimination, or oppression you will face out there, we have your back. No one talks about how that mediates some of those negative things, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here today, you and I, Gil. We wouldn't be here if there weren't those protections, those resiliency factors that we have always had as a people, that we're somehow not seeing or hearing or talking about, because they're still there. It's not like they're all gone. But we got to remember that disintegration. Add a little crack to that. We're not talking about I can drink you under the table. We're talking about crack, crystal meth, heroin. Those are the kind of things that are the other layers on already numerous layers that have been unaddressed.
Time is not an ally, so in closing, can you tell me a little bit about what seemed obvious, the need to institutionalize this momentum that you've generated and the enormity of its scope? It's more than any lecture or speech series can, even a book is not adequate.
No, it isn't. It should be a part of curriculum. And if for no one else's curriculum, ours. This legacy that we share as African people, as Africans throughout the diaspora, is a legacy that should be taught. It is a legacy that must be addressed by us. And it must be something that we look at very deliberately and that we tease out what are the strengths and what are the debilitating parts of it. And more importantly, to begin to do the research, to look at it specifically, to learn how to struggle well. We started there. I struggle well. I struggle like everyone else, but I try to teach people how to struggle well. How do you argue? How do you deal with stress? How do you deal with crises? You see, you learn that from everything in your environment, and you perpetuate it because the crises is coming. It's showing up, but joy comes in the morning. And you have to believe that and understand what are the tools that I can teach and I can give to people to navigate what is surely to be a difficult course. But I believe it's possible, but we have to begin to look at it collectively, not just joy. Everyone.
Is there enough time to prepare for what's coming?
We're already behind. We're already behind. But, if I didn't have hope, if I didn't believe it was possible, I have a granddaughter that's 8 months old. I gotta believe it. For her. For my grandson. For my granddaughter that's 9, that's brilliant and sees all the possibilities in her life, that doesn't believe there are doors that are closed to them. I've got to do it for them. I've got to teach them, not by saying, go out, we are the world, but giving them the tools to navigate that world. It's not the same as when you and I were children. It's not the same. We got iPods now. We got BET Uncut. We got video. We have to figure out how you navigate that field. That's what we haven't done, and that's what we must do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure.
It's good to see you again. You've been busy, haven't you?
Oh, yes.
You've been thither and yon, and the last time we spoke, you were talking about Africa, going back to Africa, and tracing the genesis of this transition from one side of the Atlantic to another. Where have you been most recently in Africa?
Most recently I was in Ghana, and I was at Cape Coast Slave Castle and Elmina Slave Castle. So that's the most recent visit.
All right, let's move back across the Atlantic. You have been to the Ellis Island. You've been through that, and you've seen the Statue of Liberty up close. Tell me about it. I see the catalogs here.
Yeah, this would be the first time, a couple of weeks ago, that I actually visited the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. I think there's a part of me, that had a vague curiosity, but because of the information that I kind of already knew, I never felt really all that, compelled to go. But I decided, and a really good friend of mine who now works and basically is looking at trying to improve a lot of things around, these national parks, he said, you should go, Joyce. So I went. And because I had already seen renderings, I'd been to France and was aware that there were various models of what the ultimate Statue of Liberty was to be, replete with chains. So I was very curious about how that would be handled. I also knew that the architect, the artist, and the basically the producers, if you will, of the Statue of Liberty decided upon this statue in 1865. So, of course, this coincides with the end of the Civil War and the consequently the end to slavery. The chains, which originally were in her left hand and at her feet, were struck from the statue, clearly. But I was waiting for an opportunity on my tour to ask the tour guide. So the tour guide, very enthusiastic man, he said, he's kind of explaining all these details. And so right off the bat, he says, are there any questions? I said, well, my question is, what happened to the chains that were originally on the Statue of Liberty? And he looks at me and he goes, thank you for asking that question. We will cover it a little later. So I kind of waited, and we went through, showing the dimensions and all of that, and I just waited. And finally, we got to the point where they actually had the different statues of those who were responsible for building the superstructure that it sits on, which is on top of a fort, all of these different things. And he said there was a little argument that went on. The artist wanted to really fought for the chains. He says, I really want those chains there. They were a part of acknowledging as a gift from France this idea of liberty and freedom, specifically one of the issues being the end of slavery, which of course the chains represent. And there were those in America that opposed it, saying we don't want it to be specifically focused on slavery. We want a broader sense of liberty. And there were all these various beliefs about why they didn't want it. So what used to be a left hand holding the chain became her clutching what looks like tablets. I said, well, help me understand how we reconcile. Sit us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. Help me understand how you reconcile that with the absolute obliteration of anything that suggests that slavery had anything to do with it. How did they reconcile that hypocrisy? And his answer was, I don't know how they reconcile what was an obvious hypocrisy. However, the chains are still there. I said, really?
Where?
Exactly. So I said, because I was there. I was literally there. And I said, well, are you kidding me? He goes, no, they're there. He says, that was the one thing the artist fought for and won, that they would never be able to remove completely the chains. So then he pulled out the picture of the statue with the chains, and then he showed the chains, blown up picture of her feet, and there are chains there at her feet. However, they are not visible. The only way you can actually see those chains is if you happen to be in a helicopter looking down, okay, but from the pedestal.
With a zoom lens.
Yes, with a zoom lens. Shot. But from the pedestal, from anyone walking around, they are not visible. And I thought to myself, they are invisible like we are.
Let me ask you what might be a touchy question. Were any of the guides that you could see burnt of skin?
That would be no. Not that I could see. Most of the guides were European, or of European descent. And part of, I guess, my concern is I was coming, you have to understand, there were huge groups of people. Among them were children. Among them were students from elementary through high school. Latino, African, all, these children, on their field trip to the Statue of Liberty. And I thought about that as an educator and thought to myself, how unfair, how unjust, how inaccurate for them to walk through and see no reflection of themselves, when in fact the originator had them in mind. And here these black children are with no clue, and I'm wondering, because I'm going back tomorrow. I'm going back.
Right.
Because I want to see unasked if they'll volunteer the fact that those chains were there. Because I wanted these children who basically could go through, walk around, and never know anything about these chains. And here's the other travesty. These are the materials they gave me. Anyone that comes, they'll see there's a Statue of Liberty one, and then there's the Ellis Island. There is no mention of it. Now, he showed it to me, but it's not mentioned in the literature. So again, it begs the question, why is that? Why is it erased? Then I went to Ellis Island, and then it gets clear why it got erased. So I come to Ellis Island. Now, you gotta understand, I'm ambivalent. Because I recognize there's two things that are going on inside of me. One is understanding the whole process of immigration and folks coming over, even though they were not sure what the life would be, it was going to be a better life. They were choosing something different. Many of them, not all of them, but most of them, were looking for a better life, despite the fact that they had no clue as to what that would mean. So you come in, you're issued into a huge hall, and there's a room that I now learned is called the peopling of America. Whatever.
What does that mean?
You'll see. So I go in, and of course there's an entire tour. There's an audio tour. So I got the audio tour of a friend of mine and I, and they're talking to you through all of the little parts. But before you get to that, there's another room, which is a peopling room, peopled. So I'm over here and I'm looking around, and on one side, on my left, is a huge screen, and on my right is a chart. And on the chart are the little, figures of the number of immigrants coming in from particular countries, right? So you see a lot of them, a little bit, and you see years. And I'm looking at that, and then all of a sudden I notice that there's a little legend, and the legend says, I want you to hear this, it says, non-voluntary immigrants.
Non-voluntary.
And I'm thinking to myself, well, now, can they just not say the word slaves? But you see, it got sanitized. And one might think, if you saw non-voluntary, that they just kind of got lost and showed up. Maybe they accidentally happened upon the land. But you wouldn't know they came in the belly of ships, that they were raped along the way, that they were chained in their excrement. You wouldn't know that. You just think of them as, well, they're non-voluntary immigrants.
All right. Time for another break.
All right.
We'll be back after this. All right, let's talk about some present-day issues. There's an economic depression that some call a recession, and argue about that. But what is your diagnosis of the impact that it is having on the African American community?
Well, I think just very simply put, those that are struggling or that have the less, economic means are going to suffer greater. And it's always been that way. I've often thought about the Depression, the Great Depression. And I, in school and even the media, there's an incredible history of pictures of people in soup lines, and there are pictures of people, families kind of living in this. There is almost never anyone black identified, because if you were to contrast that with the black experience during the Depression, again, white man has a cold, black man has pneumonia. So what we're seeing in terms of this is a greater desperation on every level, economically, socially. Everything is becoming much more heightened in terms of the African American experience, because again, the having little and then having what you have that is there taken away is, there's a greater level of desperation, a greater level of fear, of anxiety, of suffering. So yeah, it's much greater.
Do you pick up much anger in the communities where you speak, African American communities?
Anger with regard
about
to
the greed factor that many.
But here's the thing, and this is being talked about quite a bit. That when people start talking about we're going to have this war on crime and war on drugs, and we're going to go after it. And what's depicted in the media, we got numbers of police shows where you see them taking down the drug dealer and they're slamming them into the cars, and this is the drug dealer who had the little drug, and they busted it, and everybody's going, my goodness, how great. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? This is how you're dealing with the drug trade? The multi-billion-dollar drug trade is by Joe Kid on the corner selling drugs and arresting him and his whole crew and maybe his family, and now everybody can sit comfortably And we've not considered the fact that, well, there got to be folks that export it, that own the planes, that own multi-billion. It's not him, but the distraction is him. And those who are struggling there down at the bottom say, excuse me, you're coming after me. How about the old boy that just went to jail that stole billions of dollars? How about him? Who's the bad guy here? And so what ends up happening is you create, and this is something that David Cole assessed. He talks about the whole idea of race and the criminal justice system, race and class, and the whole idea that there is it has an opposite effect. People are less likely to feel like I need to conform to the codes and the morals and the laws of a society that is not just to me, and that somehow turns its head when it comes to those who are really reaping the benefits economically of crime. And you pick the crime, white collar, blue collar, whatever collar you want. You begin to look at who's reaping the benefits of that. And they don't look like the people who we see on television being arrested. And so there is this kind of feeling of antisocial, if you will, a reluctance to embrace or to trust a system that identifies them as a culprit. And when we begin to look at it, when you unfold it Enron, it goes on and on and on in terms of who's doing what and who's making the big bucks with crime, straight up crime. But once again, it gets sanitized, you see, because I don't know, they're wearing suits, they're white, I don't know, but it gets sanitized. So you have this kind of anger that's reverberating on the ground where folks are trying to survive. And no crime is okay, don't get me wrong. The crack dealer is no better in terms of his behavior and her behavior and engaging in that. But why is it this person here is demonized for that behavior? And yet these other individuals, I don't know, they get, luxury cells while they amass these fortunes and literally impact nations with it.
With the evaporation of jobs, especially in the African American community, this must cause great trauma in the household.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that?
One of the things that, I live in Georgia, and one of the things that we're seeing is with the increased desperation becomes an increase in all other sorts of things, like, for example, stress and anxiety. So it has a physiological impact on people where the stress is producing illness. Not only is there that stress producing illness, but it's again producing a level of desperation where people are becoming much more fearful, not really seeing a way out in some ways. And so there's two things that happen. Again, I've said it before in the show. You implode or you explode, and both are happening. And part of it is economics. Part of it is it's relentless. There's no lift for it. And again, we have disintegration happening on a variety of levels because you have there's this kind of romanticized idea about America and what America, again, start going back to the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, one has to ask the question, where are these things for us? Now, the average person goes, well, if you just work hard and, you just keep your nose clean and everything will turn out okay.
Work hard where? At what job?
This is my point. It's got to be your fault. And if you start looking at this in terms of Elizabethan poor laws, this has come out of Europe. They considered it some sort of a moral, spiritual deficiency for you to be poor. And they put you in jail for it, right? Something got to be wrong with you morally, spiritually, that you're poor. Right? So you have this kind of feeling that people, and then the guilt associated with it. Why can't I get myself? Why can't I? Again, there are no resources, and particularly in your community. But then whose fault is that? Well, if you people would just, we don't own the communities.
Yes, I've heard that phrase.
See, so all of those things that are set up, and far be it for me to, to look at and simplify the entire dilemma associated with the economic system in America, but we have to appreciate that people, are hardworking, good folk just trying to do their lives. I see them all over the country, but they're demonized.
Okay. We'll be demonized if we run over too much. So let's try to undemonize. We'll be back. All right, as you were pummeling me in our station break, there's some areas that you wanted to ventilate on.
Two of them. The first area being kind of my final assessment in being at Ellis Island, and the other is looking at remedy and response to kind of a parallel process from Africa to here. When I told you I saw the thing about Africans, which is the only thing you see about black people is the non-voluntary immigrants. And then there's a huge screen, which if you don't pay attention closely, it looks like some beautiful parts of the country. It's a moving kind of video thing. That's about natives. And the number of tribes that it started off. And then how they were, quote, reduced. Again, we're going to clean that up because we're not going to talk about, well, they talk about the diseases that affected them, but how about what, well, amounts to genocide? Okay, those words aren't used. Slaughter, genocide. No, reduced numbers. Then we move on, and what I want to speak to is when we start talking about how do we remedy this, how do we teach children of color, in particular in America, African-American children, to feel good about who they are, to strive, to want to achieve, to not feel helpless or victimized or any of those things that about. We go through, and you get to a point where it goes, imagine what it would feel like. A place you've never been, you don't know if you're going to be able to stay or go. Imagine what it must feel like living in these quarters. And I'm looking at the quarters, and these are like bunks, hammocks, 2 sinks. Looks pretty good to me, right? I'm going, imagine what those non-voluntary immigrants experience. And if you're going to put this picture up, put that one up too. How dare you ignore? Because you want me to empathize. You want me to feel the struggle and the suffering and the fear, and I'm okay with that. But who cries for them? The 10,000 buried in the African burial ground that's not on the tour. Where is the empathy for them? Where is the headphones saying, imagine? Not only not wanting to go, not knowing where you're going to go, and having your children, your wives, your people raped in front of you. Imagine that. Not wanting to go and not knowing where you're going. Where is the picture there? They were issued into another room where they say, and then they underwent medical prodding to determine if they were fit to stay or they're going to be sent back. And in this case, and I look closely because you know